There is a version of this story that most people never got to hear. Not the television version. Not the highlight reel of loud engines and laughing men in a Utah garage. The real version. The one where two guys who genuinely loved the same thing ended up on completely different sides of a story that neither of them fully controlled. And now, after everything that has happened, after the lawsuits and the federal marshals and the silence that stretched across months, the picture is finally becoming clear enough to understand. This is what really happened between Heavy D and Diesel Dave. It started, as most great partnerships do, completely by accident. Dave Sparks and Dave Kiley met at a church singles event in Utah. They were two ordinary guys looking for ordinary conversation, and they found something else entirely. An obsession. The same one. Diesel engines, custom builds, the kind of mechanical thinking that most people find overwhelming, and these two men found almost like a language they had always spoken. They recognized each other immediately, not socially, but structurally. They were built from the same raw material. And when two people like that find each other, the thing they build together tends to be extraordinary. What followed was years of genuine work. A small repair shop in Woods Cross, Utah, with no investors and no cameras and no guarantee of anything except that they were doing something they loved. They built trucks late into the night. They filmed what they were doing, not because they had strategy, but because the builds were too wild not to document. Those early YouTube videos caught something real, something that audiences could feel immediately. These were not performers. These were two men who genuinely could not imagine doing anything else. And that authenticity is what carried everything forward. By January 2016, Diesel Brothers was on Discovery Channel, and the garage that two mechanics had built out of shared obsession was now being broadcast to millions. 7 seasons. That number matters because it represents not just longevity, but a kind of trust that audiences do not extend to shows they are not genuinely invested in. People watched because the chemistry between Heavy D and Diesel Dave looked effortless. It looked like friendship in its most natural form. But here is something that nobody on the outside could see clearly. Underneath that chemistry, underneath the builds and the laughs and the shared identity, there was a machine growing larger than either man had prepared for. Success changes the geometry of a partnership. That is not a criticism, it is just the truth. When you are two guys in a garage, every decision is immediate and personal. When you are a television brand with merchandise lines and national exposure, every decision has legal weight, financial consequence, and public meaning. The pressure that comes with that kind of scale is not the kind you can simply absorb by working harder. It reshapes everything it touches. The first sign that the pressure was becoming something more serious came from a direction nobody expected. In 2017, a group of Utah physicians focused on air quality filed a lawsuit alleging that emission systems on diesel trucks featured on the show were being bypassed or disabled. The practice associated with the criticism was rolling coal, where trucks are modified to produce heavy black exhaust. For the doctors, this was not a question of entertainment taste. It was a public health concern. And here is the detail that changed everything about the legal situation. The television show itself became part of the evidence. Footage from Diesel Brothers was referenced in court proceedings, meaning that every dramatic plume of black smoke, every moment of maximum exhaust captured for viewer reaction, had become documentation of exactly what the lawsuit alleged. By 2018, a federal injunction was already in place, restricting certain modifications under the Clean Air Act. But the story did not end there. By 2020, financial penalties had reached over $760,000 paid to the United States government and an additional $90,000 to Davis County. The following year, legal fees added nearly another $1 million paid to the Utah Physicians Group. An appeal court used language that stood out starkly from the usual tone of regulatory rulings. It described the conduct as flagrant misconduct. Those two words are not filler. They represent a deliberate characterization by a federal court of a pattern that continued even after legal warnings had been issued. What this created beneath the surface of the show that fans were still watching was a growing weight of legal exposure that was becoming impossible to manage casually. The original lawsuit had sought over $100 million. Even the reduced outcome was enough to mark a structural shift in what the brand actually was. And then came the second collision from an entirely different direction. Diesel SPA, an Italian clothing company with decades of history built around that single word, filed a trademark infringement case. The Diesel Brothers merchandise line, Diesel Power Gear, had been built directly on the word that the Italian company owned in the fashion space. By 2023, a federal court had ruled against the Diesel brothers' business entities and ordered them to pay $11,800,000 in damages. The original request had been closer to $59 million, and the judge reduced it significantly. But even the reduced number was not a fine. It was structural damage. When you add it to everything that had already accumulated through the environmental case, media reporting began describing the total legal exposure as approaching $13 million. Now here is where the story between Heavy D and Diesel Dave becomes something more personal and more complicated than a legal timeline, because the show had already ended before the worst of the public fallout. In 2023, both men had agreed to step away from Discovery Channel production. They chose YouTube independence instead. And this detail rewrites the popular narrative completely. The story that fans told themselves, the story of a dramatic falling out between two brothers, was not quite accurate. The split from television was a joint decision. It was quiet, structural, mutual. It was not Heavy D versus Diesel Dave. It was two men making a business choice together. But what came after is where the paths diverged completely. October 2025. Heavy D was on camera talking through what looked like a restructuring of assets. Custom-built trucks, shop equipment, inventory being put up for sale. Fans initially read it as a business pivot. But in legal circles, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like liquidation under the pressure of outstanding court obligations. And before the process could fully complete, a federal judge stepped in and halted parts of the sale mid-process. The concern was asset movement during active enforcement, and once that intervention happens, everything around it tightens instantly. On October 7, 2025, U.S. Marshals arrived at the Utah shop. Dave Sparks was arrested for contempt of court, tied to failure to comply with financial penalties. The man who had built his entire public identity around control, around the mastery of machines that most people would walk away from, was now being escorted under federal enforcement. And when you go back and watch the announcement he had made just before, the one that looked confident and almost upbeat, it reads differently with that context. There's pressure underneath it that was not named out loud. After the arrest, Diesel Dave went quiet. No joint appearances. No public statements made alongside his former partner. No continuation of the rhythm that had defined their public presence for nearly a decade. The silence was not dramatic. It was simply there, in the place where something used to be. And the question that silence raised was not about betrayal or argument. It was something quieter and more difficult. What does a partnership actually become when one person is navigating federal custody and the other is continuing the work they once shared? Dave Kiley kept driving the Brodozer into 2026, still powered by a Cat C13 engine, still performing at events, still tied to diesel performance culture, still carrying, in a very real sense, the identity that both men had built together. He did not abandon the brand. He continued it in the form he knew. And from the outside, that looks like a kind of loyalty to the original thing, the mechanical identity that had started everything. But it also means that the shared center was gone. The chemistry that made Diesel Brothers work was a specific combination of two specific people, and that combination no longer exists in the same form. Meanwhile, Dave Sparks had been moving in a different direction even before the collapse became public. In February 2024, he acquired rights connected to the canceled Nikola Badger project, a hydrogen electric pickup concept that had been announced with real industry attention before Nikola Corporation shut it down in 2020. Those rights became part of his work with EMB-BR Motors, a venture focused on hydrogen and electric vehicle development. The man who became famous for diesel smoke and rolling coal was now building around 0M. Emission systems. That contrast is hard to simply note and move past. It is not incidental. It is the central irony of where his story has arrived. 5 months after the arrest, on March 10, 2026, Ashley Sparks filed for divorce. The timing spoke without needing explanation. Within a single compressed stretch of time, Heavy D had gone through federal arrest, ongoing legal pressure, a liquidation that was partially halted by court order, a business identity that had been fractured by years of legal exposure, and now the personal structure of his life was breaking too. These were not separate events happening on parallel tracks. They were the same pressure expressing itself through every layer of a life at once. When you lay out the full sequence without editorializing it, what emerges is not a story about two friends who fell out. It is a story about what happens when the thing you built becomes too large and too legally exposed to survive in the form it took. The Diesel Brothers brand was never just trucks and television. It was a very specific kind of relationship made visible. The effortlessness that audiences responded to was real. The connection was genuine. But genuine connection does not protect you from federal law. It does not protect a trademark from challenge. It does not make a financial obligation disappear. What Heavy D has finally revealed, not through a single statement, but through the arc of everything that has happened, is that the partnership did not end with betrayal. It ended with divergence under pressure. One man stayed close to the original identity. The other tried to rebuild in a completely different direction. And the question of which of those responses is right, or whether either is right, is the kind of question that does not have a clean answer. Because survival after something like this does not look like triumph. It looks like continuing to move in whatever direction is still available. The garage in Woods Cross, where two Daves worked late into the night on trucks that nobody was paying them to build, is still the most honest version of this story. Not because the show was fake, but because that was the moment before scale changed the geometry of everything. Before the brand needed to carry the weight of merchandise empires and trademark disputes and federal environmental enforcement. Before two men who were genuinely the same kind of person ended up living completely different outcomes because of decisions that accumulated around them faster than either of them could fully account for. What really happened between Heavy D and Diesel Dave is not a betrayal story. It is a pressure story. And pressure does not care about friendship or chemistry or 7 seasons of television that meant something to millions of people. It simply finds the points where the structure cannot hold anymore, and it keeps pushing until something gives. The only question left now is whether what remains on either side of that collapse is enough to build something forward from. And that is a question that neither man has fully answered yet.